Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time here at Southwest Park Baptist Church. This is our lesson for Sunday, September the 7th. We're starting a new unit of study with a study theme division, so that'll be the next 4 weeks. Here this week our lesson is entitled A Divided Kingdom. We're back in 1 Kings chapter 12. We'll look at the first 24 verses in chapter 12 today. The biblical truth, division occurs when wisdom is ignored. We've spent several weeks studying about Solomon and how he had been the wisest man on earth after requesting wisdom from God. And his reign as king brought prosperity to Israel. But late in his reign, things began to unravel a little bit, and in chapter 11, we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, we were introduced to Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam is Solomon's son, who would be the natural successor. Jeroboam is an Ephraimite. He's the son of a widow, and his humble origins there kind of contrast with his rise to prominence. He's described in chapter 11 as a mighty man of valor and industrious, and he came to Solomon's attention, and he was appointed by Solomon to oversee the forced labor, which ironically is the system that would later fuel rebellion, as we'll see here in a few minutes. We talked about how the prophet Ahijah met Jeroboam on the road one day, and Ahijah was wearing a new garment, a new cloak, and the two were alone in the field, and Ahijah took the garment off and he tore it into 12 pieces. And so the tearing of the garment there is a dramatic symbol of the coming divided kingdom. Jeroboam received 10 of those pieces of the garment, signifying that he would be ruler over 10 of the tribes. That split that's prophesied there by Ahijah is not an arbitrary thing. It's rooted in Solomon's idolatry. As we studied about Solomon late in his life, he worshipped Ashtoreth, Chemosh, Milcom, and the prophecy was that the kingdom would be torn from him, not from him, but from his descendants, and yet God preserved one tribe of Judah. Benjamin's likely included in that for David's sake. And so Solomon responded to this threat by attempting to kill Jeroboam, and he fled to Egypt, and his flight to Egypt foreshadows Egypt's later role in Israel's affairs. When Rehoboam becomes king and Jeroboam's king of the northern tribes, Pharaoh Shishak would eventually invade Judah. The chapter 11 ends with Solomon's death. The period that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. And then Solomon rested with his father and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam his son reigned in his place. So we move into chapter 12, and we're going to see what happens here. Our first point is verses 1 through 8 in chapter 12. So let's take a look at those verses. Then Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard about it, he stayed in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon's presence. Jeroboam stayed in Egypt. But they summoned him, and Jeroboam and the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam. Your father made our yoke harsh. You, therefore, lighten your father's harsh service and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. Rehoboam replied, Go away for 3 days and then return to me. And so the people left. Then King Rehoboam consulted with the elders who had served his father Solomon when he was alive, asking, How do you advise me to respond to these people? They replied, Today, if you will be a servant to this people and serve them, and if you respond to them by speaking kind words to them, they will be your servants forever. But he rejected the advice of the elders who had advised him and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and attended him. Jeroboam and all Israel, and when it says all Israel, it's talking about the northern tribes of Israel, they went to Shechem. Shechem, of course, is a major ancient city, a favorite religious site for the northern tribes. It's about 40 miles north of Jerusalem. And in going there and meeting with the representatives from the northern tribes, Rehoboam was following the pattern that was established by David. You remember that David initially became king over Judah, and he was king of Judah for 7 years before he consolidated his throne and became king over all of Israel. So the northern tribes had made a personal covenant with David there. And so this meeting follows along those same lines to renew their loyalty to the Davidic monarchy, and negotiations of the terms of that submission is part of the process here. Our lesson writer makes a note that Rehoboam's coronation at Shechem was an indication of his weakened position. Shechem was where Abraham had received God's covenant back in Genesis 12. It's where Joshua challenged the people to follow the Lord. Yet Jerusalem's now the city of David and God's chosen place for his temple. We see that in 1 Kings 9:3. Choosing to meet the king in Shechem was kind of like drawing a dividing line here before negotiating. Verse 2 tells us that Jeroboam is still in Egypt, and when he heard the news of Solomon's death, he stayed in Egypt. But the northern tribes asked him to return. And his return is not just political, it's prophetic, because we've already seen how that the Lord has told him that he'll be king over the northern part of the kingdom. The people called him back, showing their trust in him as a leader and a reformer. Now, verse 3 kind of ends in mid-sentence there. It says, the whole assembly of Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam. But as we'll see, they're going to ask Rehoboam to lighten the load, to compromise some, to lessen the severe requirements that Solomon had imposed upon them. So this is part of the negotiation. The northern tribes are not rebelling, they're appealing for some reform. In verse 4, they say, "Your father made our yoke harsh." Now, a yoke was used to hitch large draft animals to a plow or a wagon. Here it's used metaphorically to describe that burden that Solomon had placed on the people to accomplish his building projects and lavish lifestyle. Ancient kings often built monuments and military garrisons, and they usually used the labor of captured enemies. But Solomon's reign, for the most part, was peaceful. And so he didn't have this kind of labor pool. So instead he drafted Israelites to work, and we saw when he's building the temple and he's building his palace, he had a force of 30,000 Israelites, and 10,000 worked a month, and then they went home for 2 months, and so that continued there. He also divided the kingdom into 12 districts, each responsible for providing 1 month's provision for the king and his royal household and their kind of lavish lifestyle. So, Jeroboam and the Israelites presented their case to the king. If Rehoboam would reduce the hard labor that Solomon had placed on the people, then they would serve the new king. Service to the king was an expectation. They understood that. But the level of requirement could be misused and abused. And so Israel's kings were supposed to shepherd and serve for the good of the people. But sin, foolishness, unwise actions have derailed many from such goals. Warren Wiersbe, in his commentary, says the people were willing to serve Rehoboam if only he would serve them and make life a bit easier for them. All of God's truly great leaders had been servants to the people: Moses, Joshua, Samuel, especially David. But Solomon had chosen to be a celebrity more than a servant. Rehoboam was following his bad example. And when the Son of God came to earth, he came as a servant. He taught his disciples to lead by serving. Jesus washed his disciples' feet as an example of humble service, and he wants us to follow his example. So this was the request that the people made of Rehoboam. Verse 5 tells us that Rehoboam asked for some time to consider this. He said, "Go away for 3 days and then return." And so the people agreed, and they did that. The first thing that Rehoboam did was to seek advice from his father's advisors, those who had advised Solomon. This is, and they're called the elders, and the elders usually carries the connotation of older people who have gained wisdom through experience. And so him turning to them was a wise move. Proverbs 12:15 says, "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise." Proverbs 15 says, "Without counsel, plans go awry, but in the multitude of counselors, they're established." So that's the first place he turns, and he asks them for their advice about how to respond to the request. They said that he should be a kind servant leader. Following this wisdom would earn a good standing with his people. That's the way kindness acts and the kind of response that it gets. Our lesson writer makes a note that the elders' wise advice resembled the leadership that Jesus modeled for his disciples. In his incarnation, Jesus, the Son of God, took on flesh, assumed the form of a servant. Philippians 2:5-7 tells us. And as we've already mentioned, he washed the feet of the disciples. The book of Acts tells how the disciples responded to Jesus' servant leadership. The legacy of their service has spread the gospel for generations across the world to reach even us. Warren Wiersbe says, in contrast to Rehoboam, one of the marks of David's leadership was that he was willing to humble himself and seek the mind of God and then pray for God's blessing on his decisions. Leaders who try to impress people with their skills but take no time to seek God just prove that they don't know the most important thing in spiritual leadership. In Joshua chapter 5, we read, "It came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, 'Are you for us or for our adversaries?' And he said, 'No, but as the commander of the army of the Lord I have come.' And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, 'What does my Lord say to his servant?' And then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, 'Take your sandals off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy.' And Joshua did so." So, this is the advice that the elders gave. Be a servant there, and people will serve you and respond to you. Verse 8 tells us what Rehoboam decided. He rejected the advice of the elders who had advised him, and he consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and attended him. A later king of Judah, a man named Ahijah, described Rehoboam in 2 Chronicles, chapter 13, verse 7, said, "Then worthless rogues gathered to him and strengthened themselves against Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, when Rehoboam was young and inexperienced and could not withstand them." Now, he's relatively young, and he's certainly inexperienced. The scripture tells us he was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 17 years in Jerusalem. King Solomon wrote, "The one who walks with the wise will become wise, but a companion of fools will suffer harm." In choosing to reject the wisdom of the elders who had served his father, Rehoboam chose to be a companion of fools. Like Rehoboam, these young men had grown up in privilege and wealth in the palace, and they didn't have the experience to give sound advice. Our second point, verses 10 through 17. In verse 9, it says, "But he said to them, 'What advice do you give?'" This is Rehoboam talking to the young men that he's grown up with. "How should we answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, 'Lighten the yoke which your father put on us'?" Verse 10, the young men who had grown up with him told him, "This is what you should say to the people who said to you, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us.' This is what you should tell them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Although my father burdens you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with barbed whips." So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day as the king had ordered. "Return to me on the third day." And then the king answered the people harshly. He rejected the advice the elders had given him, and he spoke to them according to the young men's advice. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with barbed whips. The king did not listen to the people because this turn of events came from the Lord to carry out his word, which the Lord had spoken through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. When all Israel saw that the king had not listened to them, the people answered him, "What portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Israel, return to your tents. David, now look after your own house." So Israel went to their tents. But Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites living in the cities of Judah. So the young men that he turned to for advice, those people who had grown up with him, his friends, advised him to exert his authority, make the burden even heavier. And so they told him, this is what you should tell him: my little finger's thicker than my father's waist. This is a hyperbolic metaphor, and it implies that Solomon will be far more oppressive than Rehoboam will be far more oppressive than Solomon was. The little finger symbolizes what should be the least powerful part of the body, and yet here it's exaggerated to be more forceful than Solomon's entire reign. So the thrust of that is that Rehoboam will be a more powerful king than his father. His policy demands will outdo Solomon's. Rather than relief, Rehoboam threatens the northern tribes with the opposite: increased demands, increased enforcement of them. In verse 11, he says, even though my father burdens you with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. Instead of easing their burden, he's going to intensify it, escalating the tension. Certainly that would alienate those northern tribes. He says, my father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. Now the translation, Christian Standard Bible that we read from in the literature, says with whips, or barbed whips. Some translations use the word scourges. Literally, it's scorpions. So this is probably a whip that's embedded with metal or bone tips, probably multiple tips, designed to inflict greater pain. Warren Wiersbe says about verses 10 and 11, the young counselors were interested primarily in being important and magnifying themselves and in reinforcing the authority of the king. They thought the best way to do that was to make a show of force. Youth in general seek to have authority and freedom until they make the painful discovery that they may not be ready to use those gifts wisely. The Quest Study Bible poses the question here in verse 11, had Solomon and Rehoboam forgotten Israel's past slavery in Egypt? And it appears that they had. Both Solomon and Rehoboam authorized these state-imposed burdens on the people. They lacked the compassion that the knowledge of Israel's past experience as slaves in Egypt should have brought them. The words of Deuteronomy should have informed their rule. 3 times at least in Deuteronomy, in chapter 15, chapter 16, and chapter 24, the people are told, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. And certainly Solomon and Rehoboam should have remembered that and taken that into account. Solomon's first official decision that we studied about a few weeks ago brought him the reputation for great wisdom. Here, Rehoboam's first official decision told the nation that he was foolish and unwise. For many centuries, the Jews considered the division of the nation the greatest tragedy in their history, and they measured every other tragedy and calamity that befell it against that. So Jeroboam and the people came back to Rehoboam on the third day, just like Rehoboam had asked them to. And the king gave them the news. He answered the people harshly. He rejected the advice that the elders had given him. In Ecclesiastes 2, 18 and 19, Solomon, Rehoboam's father, lamented, "I hated all my work that I labored at under the sun, because I must leave it to the one who comes after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool." And so here we see Solomon's his angst coming to fruition as Rehoboam responds in this foolish manner. He told them exactly what the young men had advised him. My father made your yoke heavy, but I'm going to make it heavier. My father disciplined you with whips, I'll discipline you with barbed whips. And verse 15 makes a significant point. You remember back in chapter 11, when we're introduced to Jeroboam, that Ahijah, the prophet, had met Jeroboam. He tore that cloak into 12 pieces, and he prophesied. He told Jeroboam the kingdom would be divided, and he would be the ruler. So the Quest Study Bible poses the question here, did God cause Rehoboam to reject the people's request? Their response kind of equivocates, yes and no. On the one hand, God worked in and through the circumstances that led to Rehoboam's decision. But on the other hand, Rehoboam made his decision, and he's responsible for the consequences. In this sense, the turn of events was from the Lord. Well, verse 16 tells us the response of the northern tribes. When they saw that the king had not listened to them, the people answered, "What portion do we have in David?" So this is, they're angry, they're frustrated, and they reject Rehoboam's leadership, saying that they have no part, they have no future with David's descendants. And the call is to return to your tents, a call to disband, return home. In essence, it's a declaration of succession from the southern tribe, Judah. See to your own house. It's kind of a sharp dismissal. You take care of Judah, we're done with you, we'll do our own thing. So we see here, to kind of recap the events up through verse 16. In the first 4 verses, the people led by Jeroboam asked Rehoboam to lighten the burden that Solomon had placed on them. Rehoboam consulted the 2 groups. Elders advise servant leadership and leniency. His peers advocate harshness and bravado. Verse 11 is the climax to the young man's advice, which Rehoboam adopts. The response fulfills the prophecy of Ahijah, where God declares that the kingdom will be torn from Solomon's line due to idolatry and oppression. Rehoboam's arrogance leads to the division of the kingdom. 10 tribes reject him, and they crown Jeroboam as king. There's substantial biblical and historical evidence of long-standing jealousy and ill will between the northern tribes and Judah, especially Ephraim and Judah. And it plays a role here in the division of the kingdom. Ephraim was one of the largest, most powerful tribes. Ephraim often saw itself as the rightful leader of Israel, and that pride clashed with Judah's divine appointment as the royal line. With Jerusalem as the capital and temple site, Judah became the religious and political center, further alienating the northern tribes. This jealousy toward Judah wasn't just political. It was spiritual, cultural, prophetic. It shaped centuries of conflict, from the split of the kingdom to the warnings of the prophet. Scripture holds out hope for healing, pointing toward a future where tribal envy gives way to unity under God's reign. Isaiah 11 says, "There shall come forth a rod from the stem of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord." Then down in verse 10, "And in that day there shall be a root of Jesse who shall stand as a banner to the people, for the Gentiles shall seek him, and his resting place shall be glorious." And then verse 13 says, "The envy of Ephraim shall depart, the adversaries of Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not envy Judah, and Judah shall not harass Ephraim." So those verses envisions a future reconciliation, implying that envy and harassment were ongoing realities in Israel. It's kind of interesting. That goes all the way back to the account in Genesis where Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. You remember it was Judah that had suggested that they not kill Joseph but sell him into slavery. And after Joseph rose to prominence in Egypt, and Jacob's family, seeking relief from the famine, came to Egypt, and they finally talked Jacob into letting Benjamin go, and Joseph was going to keep Benjamin. It was Judah that interceded for Benjamin and offered himself as a substitute for Benjamin. And so the rivalry between Joseph is part of the family, and that's Ephraim. They're descendants of Joseph. And Judah, that's the descendants of the brother Judah. That's a long-standing rivalry. So it's kind of interesting that we see this coming to pass here, and all this after centuries, culminating in the division of the kingdom. Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites living in the cities of Judah, verse 17 tells us. So Rehoboam had two options, as we've talked about: gentleness or force. And out of pride, he followed the advice of his peers, and he chose force. Rehoboam ruled over the Israelites living in the cities of Judah. Now in verse 20 it says, "Only the tribe of Judah followed Rehoboam." But we have to remember that Benjamin, Simeon, and a lot of the Levites were centered in Judah. The cities of Judah there, the southern, that area of Judah also included the allotment of Simeon. Joshua 19 tells us that that consisted of 17 cities. But Simeon was absorbed by Judah, and their allotment was completely within the inheritance of the children of Judah. This was not accidental. This fulfills Jacob's words in Genesis 49, where Simeon and Levi are cursed for their violence at Shechem. Levi's scattering becomes sacred through priestly service. Simeon's scattering is geographic. They're absorbed into Judah and lose their tribal borders. Well, after Rehoboam passed this information along to the northern tribes and they left, King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue, to try to collect here. But all Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. And therefore, King Rehoboam mounted his chariot in haste to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Rehoboam planned to declare war on Israel, but he canceled his plans when the Lord appeared to him and instructed him not to. Earlier, he had ignored the counsel of his elders, but he now heeded the counsel of the Lord, and so he spared the lives of many Israelites by not engaging in a civil war. The history of the divided kingdom begins right here and continues through 2 Kings. Jeroboam reigned over the 10 northern tribes, usually known as Israel, sometimes as Ephraim. This kingdom had a succession of 9 dynasties. All the kings were wicked. Rehoboam reigned over the southern kingdom known as Judah. This kingdom had 1 dynasty. All the kings were descendants of David. And it was through this lineage, through this kingdom, that Christ's legal title to the throne of David is traced through Joseph. A few of those kings were reformers and God-fearers, but most of them were wicked as well. And so over the next few weeks, we'll study about some of that. This week, we see the kingdom divided because of Rehoboam's unwise choices that's brought division. What do we learn from our lesson this week? God's sovereign judgment, as prophesied to Solomon and Jeroboam, was fulfilled through Rehoboam's actions. Rehoboam didn't listen to the people but responded harshly, and that whole scenario, the people's request, the king's response, the people's rebellion, fulfilled God's word. The discipline against Solomon was experienced and simultaneously earned by his son. But there was purpose and grace in this punishment. Through the division, idolatry and pride were shown to be counterproductive. Some wise kings learned this lesson. Many foolish kings did not. Beyond this, the Lord showed his faithfulness and grace in keeping Rehoboam as king over the tribe of Judah, because the Lord would not fail to fulfill his promise to David and to send us our Messiah King, Jesus Christ. James, the apostle, explained that worldly wisdom is marked by bitter envy and selfish ambition. But godly wisdom is first pure, then peace-loving, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without pretense. God's Word and God's Spirit help us to discern what's godly wisdom that we should follow. When Rehoboam heard the people's grievances, his heart was unmoved. By contrast, in the gospel accounts, we consistently find Jesus is moved with compassion. Matthew 9:36 says, "But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them because they were weary and scattered like sheep, having no shepherd." Chapter 20, verse 34 says, Jesus had compassion and touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him. Mark 1:41, Jesus, moved with compassion, stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I'm willing, be cleansed." Luke 7:13, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Jesus' compassion moved him to serve those who were in need. Rehoboam resisted wise advice that he didn't like. Instead, he chose to go where he was comfortable with his friends. Leaders inevitably have to make difficult decisions as well as do uncomfortable, hard things, not the least of which is letting go of their own pride to follow good, even though unpleasant advice. Proverbs 19:20 says, "Listen to counsel and receive instruction, that you may be wise in your latter days. There are many plans in a man's heart. Nevertheless, the Lord's counsel, that will stand. What is desired in a man is loving kindness." Isaiah 30:21 says, "Your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, 'This is the way, walk in it,' whenever you turn to the right hand or whenever you turn to the left." In Philippians 4:8, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are noble, whatsoever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report. If there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things." So we need to pray that we'll discern counsel that's wise from that which is self-serving. Ephesians 4:14 and 15 says, we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting, but speaking the truth in love, may we grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ. Next week we'll pick back up with verse 25 in chapter 12, and we'll continue this unit of study on divisions, the divided kingdom. Thank you.